So going back to graduate school for a couple minutes, can you tell me about some of the projects that you did? I know the dissertation, of course, has a couple of chapters in it. I'm assuming each of those is in some version being turned into their own published paper. Can you talk to me a little bit about maybe how you chose those projects or how your research focus changed over the years?
Yeah. It's actually pretty discrete. I would say there are three. I worked on a lot of little things here and there, but like three big ones. My second week of graduate school, September 19th, 2017 was the Mexico City earthquake. Same day as the 1985 event. And Mexico City famously has these like soft, really low shear wave velocity clays, and the whole basin will amplify and like destroy buildings.
So broadly speaking, that takes earthquake shaking waves, makes them stronger, and causes more damage.
Yeah, it concentrates the energy of the waves, and that makes the displacement and the accelerations on the surface larger at certain frequencies, or it moves the energy around in frequencies, and that, when it lines up with the resonance frequencies of the buildings, causes big issues.
And what's the resonant frequency of a building?
Everything in the world has a resonance frequency. It's basically like if you sing an A into a guitar, the A string will vibrate, and that's because there's little... I'm qualified for this, but not the most qualified. But that's basically because the vibrations that are moving through the air are the same as the frequency that string wants to vibrate at. And that's a function, in the case of the string, of the tension and the length. And so that's basically like when you pluck it, if it's stiff, it will move, the energy will move faster along that string. But because you're sending energy at that frequency past the string will vibrate. So you've excited that string. In the case of a building, it's again a function of like the stiffness and the geometry of the building. But it will like to resonate at certain frequencies. And if those frequencies line up with whatever energy you're sending through it, through an earthquake wave propagation, if those line up, the building will amplify, or can amplify, and when it amplifies, it can fall down. So that's the whole like theory. That's Lori's that's her like OG research. We've like moved on to other stuff, but like that's her grad school research, and then like there's always been a side of her research group that does that field of study.
Yeah, and to put a cap on that, I think. So Mexico City is one of the cities that's built on really like soft soils that amplify shaking waves in the frequency range that's in the same frequency range as what a lot of buildings expect to vibrate at.
Yeah, Mexico City has these like 80 to like 180 meter per second shear wave velocity soils that are basically just like volcanic ash that settled into this lake. It's Lake Texcoco, Xochimilco, and I don't remember the third one, but there were these three lakes that were there when the Spanish arrived. So we're talking like human history timescales, not geologic timescales. The Spanish filled them in, and they filled in with like volcanic ash. It's sort of rimmed by these volcanoes.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Like they filled it in manually with volcanic ash?
The clays, they filled a lot in with just their own fill, but a lot of the lakes are also had been naturally filled over geologic timescales.
Okay.
So like a lot of the deeper clays were there when the Spanish arrived. Yeah, they're these super soft clays, and as a result, Mexico City is like a really dynamic and interesting place geotechnically. The stories that you will see in the news are about the city sinking, and that's because those clays, in addition to amplifying seismic energy, are really compressive. And so when you put a bunch of buildings on them, you're putting a bunch of weight on these clays, and over time it drives water out of the pores, and the whole city is sinking. Okay. I think it's on the order of feet, maybe even meters. I don't know what the number is. I didn't study that, but that's in pop culture, like you'll see that as headlines. That's the famous one.
Okay, so that's because the soft soils that the buildings are sitting on currently filled with water, or I guess maybe previously filled with water, and as the water gets squeezed out of them over time with new, heavier buildings being put on top, the soils compress. Yeah,
and they just compress in addition to the water getting squeezed out of them because they're really loose. So there's like a combination of factors. They also are pumping a lot there, which is just making the problem worse. So they drop the water
Oh,
table.
right. That's a big problem in California.
Exactly.
Right?
Artificially remove the water in the pore space, and then
from the
it
aquifers,
settles
right?
quickly. Yeah. There's that famous photo in California of that guy standing under a pole.
Yeah.
And it's like the elevation of the ground, 100 years ago was 20 feet above his head.
Yeah. That's a tough one.
So yeah. That was my master's research, was just, that's like a really famous case. And Lori kind of gave me free rein to just go crazy, because that event was really big and relevant in the site response community. So yeah, we took like a network of accelerometers. There was like 72 or 5 of them. And they had thousands of recordings of hundreds of earthquakes, maybe thousands of earthquakes, but multiple recordings of the same event at each station. So it was an amazing data set. They installed it right after 1985. So our original, like our earliest measurement was like, there was like it was like 86. Like it made sense. Like they just installed the network right after that event happened.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. So that was that one. And then I really wanted to get in the field, and I really wanted to work in New England, because I like to think I had an ulterior motive of being a geotech engineer in the area, and I knew it would help. And no one had mapped New England site response. And I was like, I feel like we learned a ton in Mexico City. Like, let's apply this locally. And we won a grant from the USGS. So that spiraled into my first 2 dissertation chapters. And that was like the data collection, because no one had data. So it was like, let's go and take these measurements that we learned about from this really famous use case where there are huge earthquakes, and let's bring it to a place where there's no big earthquakes. We know they've happened historically, but as a result of there not being many significant ones, there hasn't been a lot of funding to do research. So let's use all these techniques that have been used elsewhere in these places that have millions and billions of dollars of damage from earthquakes every year, and let's apply them here on the cheap, learn a little something, and be a little more prepared in the future, and try and bring these maps up into the code, into like the national seismic hazard models. So that was the second one. And then the last one was really similar mentality, but it was Massachusetts specific, and it was driven by UMass Amherst, who had a grant from the Mass DOT to basically make these types of maps, and they just had amazing data. And so I sort of piggybacked on that project, because I was like, I feel I'm pretty good at this. I've looked at it a lot. I know that's a good data set. Like, let's use that for this particular purpose that Lori and I have been studying for 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those were the 3 big projects.
Yeah.
3.
That's awesome. Word. All right. So getting back into it, we talked a little bit about your first 2 big projects in graduate school. Let's talk a little bit about your third project. It is basically resulted in a GIS data set. Is that right?
Yeah. It resulted in a GIS data set. It still has the ulterior motive of like driving the use of this particular parameter for like seismic site response hazard classification. Like in the introduction, that's like what the results are supposed to lead towards. Like going back to what my undergrad thesis didn't have. Like it didn't have any purpose. It didn't have any point. Even though there was one there, I didn't verbalize that. But yeah, like, so thus far, this has been like it's just like a nice GIS data set. So yeah, it's had a great processing output.
Yeah.
We haven't driven the point of that paper, which is still in development, is to like show the use of this particular parameter.
Awesome. Well, do you want me to give a quick intro to it, and you can kind of edit my words or overwrite them, whatever.
Yeah, we're literally submitting this soon, so yeah, this will be good. Like I don't know if I can talk about it, so I need to make sure.
Awesome. Okay, so I guess I'll start with the purpose of the paper is to produce this F-naught measurement across Massachusetts.
Yeah.
To get there, you basically found values for parameters that you call alpha and beta. We find those values for alpha and beta for 4 different major geologic groupings and 4 different deposit types. And then you combine those with depth to bedrock maps to get approximate F-naught values and uncertainty values across Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
That's fair.
Awesome. And then the purpose of getting those F-naught values is to be able to estimate shear wave velocity at different depths.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the history of this.
Yeah, please.
And just interrupt if there are specific questions and I'm like pontificating on stuff that you don't want to talk about. Basically, people recognize that site response was a hazard that we should be aware of. So like in engineering, like you have your like static loads, you just have a building and it weighs a certain amount and you need to be able to support that. Then you have your live loads, which are going to be like people walking around in there. And that's going to add some stuff that you need to support. Then you have things like wind and earthquakes and stuff like that you need to increase the amount of conservatism you have in the design of whatever materials you choose, or maybe the design of the actual geometry of the building to be able to withstand those forces too. So you're just adding all these things up over time, and then you need to figure out the right materials and geometry to be able to take anything that the world can throw at it. Which, I mean, case in point of that bridge that just fell down in Maryland, they didn't have ships that big in whenever they built that bridge.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How old is the bridge? I have no idea.
I think it's over 100 years.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So yeah, that's like a case in point. It would be really hard to design for that, but that's like an example of just something that the bridge may be subject to that, some bridges in the world probably could have handled that. Certainly could have handled that.
I hadn't thought about it like that.
Yeah, that's how it works. And so like people knew about earthquakes. We're now like going into my niche of this one world, which is trying to quantify this one particular problem that just it works its way into the code, and it's accounted for. Everyone knows the magnitude scales, the Richter scale, which is not used anymore. I'd like the record to reflect that's a local magnitude scale, but regardless, like 0 to 10, although it's possible to have it's not possible to have greater than 10 on Earth, but mathematically it's feasible.
Sorry, I'm doing another sidebar here. Somebody asked me to define earthquake magnitude back when I was in college, and I did the same thing you did. I threw in so many caveats, and she looked at me. She's like, "You don't even know what it is. You don't even know what your major is."
All right, then I'll explain.
No, we don't need to.
Okay.
But I'm with you. Yeah, it is confusing.
Moment magnitude is the modern measurement of magnitude, and it will be universal anywhere on Earth. It requires an inversion, which is what makes it like different than like the Richter scale, but it's basically trying to assign a number of an amount of energy released in the movement of the plates.
Yeah.
So it's like the square area of the plates multiplied by the displacement of the actual event. And I think there's a time term in there. There's a bunch of terms in there, but that would theoretically be universal. This is a big aside. It's also not really my area of expertise because we did the site side of it. But like, so there's earthquake magnitude, and that's going to be the amount of energy released by the earthquake, and that's going to subject your building to a certain amount of force. Mm-hmm. Earthquake site response is just add a little to that. It's just like there's going to be some areas nearby where it's going to be worse. And so like that's just another term you're trying to account for. And again, like I said, engineering's imperfect, so you basically you're trying to account for these things. You're trying to say like, okay, it's possible to have earthquakes of this magnitude in this area. Ooh, and I'm also on clay. Crap. Like let's add a little bit. We got to add a little bit somehow.
So the site response is going to be how the soil underneath your building
makes that number a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. It's similar to like a lake effect in weather. There's terrible weather in Buffalo. There's like average weather all around, and then like locally there's just something weird and it throws everything off and you get 8 feet of snow. It's like that. So they knew about this. The first writing of it, I want to say 1908. There was San Francisco earthquake, which was 1906, I think. Maybe April 15th, it might be coming up. We should check that. I might just be throwing that date out.
It's close enough that I accept it.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm like, yeah.
In trivia,
people are inclined. I also just make stuff up, so you got to be careful with that. But anyway, a professor, I don't remember what university, maybe Berkeley, and I also can't remember his name, which is not being great for my historic knowledge. But anyway, he documented that these clays in San Francisco, there was more shaking on these clays and fills around the San Francisco Bay, which is like east of that like San Francisco Peninsula. So inside the Golden Gate Bridge is really where he observed and documented it. And he made figures that were kind of rudimentary, but look exactly the same as what a grad student at Tufts made, years and years later for whatever basin. So people knew about it. And then it's like, okay, we know about this phenomenon, but we need to design to it. So we need to quantify it. You have to be able to quantify stuff if you're going to be able to design things, to be able to withstand whatever that stuff is. You can't just say, oh, it's going to move. How much? So you need like parameters. You need things that give you an estimate that lets you say how much it's going to amplify this energy. And that's going to determine how much displacement there is and force on your building. In this case, it's like shear force would be the big issue. And so you need a term. So in like the 70s or the 60s, they came up with VS30. It came out of, as far as I know, it might have come concurrently in multiple places around the world, which is usually how stuff like this works. They basically just measured the average shear wave velocity over the top 100 feet. You and I in Lori's group, it's VS30. That's 30 meters. I think they picked 100 feet because all their boreholes were 100 feet deep. And so they had these shear wave velocity profiles down to 100 feet. And they just took the average.
And what's shear wave?
Shear wave velocity. Shear wave velocity is how fast waves propagate through materials. So you can have a shear wave velocity through a ruler. If you shake a ruler, it's going to determine how much the tip vibrates. If you take a slinky, this is the classic way that like your high school physics teacher would say. If you lay the slinky out on the floor and you jiggle it sideways, the shear wave velocity of the slinky is how fast the wiggle in the slinky makes it to your friend on the other side. And then if you shake it many, many times, you'll start making vibrations and you'll see cool fundamental frequencies of slinkies and stuff like that. You can make standing waves and all kinds of cool things. So that's what that is. And in this world of earthquakes, in general, the observation they made in the early 1900s, the lower the shear wave velocity profile is, the more seismic energy builds up, the more the ground shakes, the more your building's in trouble. How do we quantify that? They said, okay, we have all this data down to 100 feet. Let's take the average. And that's a pretty darn good term. You know, it's soft up here. How do we say it's soft up here? How do you quantify that? And that was the number that they came up with. And so that's like, you then say, okay, we have a number now. We can make measurements. We can take them all over the place. We need to prepare our societies for this. Let's just pretend you and I are in California. What's a good way to communicate this number to people or provide it to local engineers so they can account for it without having to go through so much trouble to measure it themselves? That costs a lot of money. You need specialized people to do it. Let's start building maps. So people just started making maps of VS30. And so, yeah, there's just like maps of this number. It's often correlated to geology, like softer geologic deposits have lower VS30 values or VS100s, whatever. And that's kind of how that worked. And then VS30 works its way into the code. And that is how you basically build these things called design spectra. And that's what you would have to design your structure to. And it would just change that spectra around a little bit.
Awesome.
Yeah, sorry. That's the background, and that leads to the point of this paper, which is that VS30 isn't all-encompassing. And that's because the ground shakes at different frequencies, and that frequency is very important, and VS30 doesn't say anything about that. So Lori and I were pushing for this F-naught term, which is literally the fundamental frequency of the ground, which is proportional to the shear wave velocity and the depth to a hard layer. And we pretty much said, not only do we think that this value is important in quantifying this phenomenon, we're going to take it a step further, and we're going to go through the entire cycle that people went through over the decades in the 1900s, and we're going to start making maps of it. So we had a bunch of these measurements, a bunch of these parameters, and we built a map out of it. So it's following that same logic, just with a different parameter. Sorry, continue.
No, that was perfect. That was a much, much better background than I could have given on the cuff. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and that's what you read is written for, like, we're trying to get that published. So we're assuming so much knowledge. Like we're like assuming. So yeah, the story I just told isn't in there.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly what I was looking for. And I did a little bit of background internet searching, and that was a much better background than I could have put together myself on a short notice. So from what I can tell, you pretty much did it, right? Like you got the V-naught, the F-naught maps put together, right? Do you have these published? Are these going to be online?
So the F-naught is going to be online. We're going to submit it to probably Earthquake Spectra literally in the next month. I'm changing the VS30 figure in there because they just redid the code. So I'm changing
really?
that. Yeah, they just added some additional site classes. So that's the last touch that's going into one of the last figures.
Is that the figure 20 that I got confused on?
It's probably 20A.
Yep, that was exactly.
Or maybe 20B. No, it's not that. It's not that. No, it's not that one. It's probably on the next page.
Anyway,
that's neither here nor there.
So they changed. What did they change?
That
How
figure
how you compute the?
No, it's not how you
VS30?
compute it. They just it's the VS30 map. Another fun thing that humans do. I just told this story of people coming up with this parameter, which is a continuous measurement. We then break up measurements to simplify things. And now that I work at an engineering firm, you have to do that. I studied this thing for years and years. I want people to realize that there's a huge range of numbers and a huge range of outcomes. You have to chunk things up. So people just chunk up VS30s, and the site class is actually what determines how it affects the building design. And the site class is just a range of possible VS30s. So they increase the number of subdivisions, which is good. That's saying
that makes sense.
Yeah, we're saying that we understand this enough to chunk it up into more buckets.
So do you have 16 buckets in yours? The 4 geologic groupings and 4 soil deposits?
Okay, so that's also the same logic of people bucketing things, but so now we're getting into the methodology. So Lori and I have been mapping F-naught for even the first 2 chapters. We originally did it the way that they originally did VS30, which is we have a bunch of points and we have a bunch of good geologic maps. Let's just group all the points into their geologies and take the average and call it a day. Period. Really rudimentary. The only exciting thing about that is people hadn't done it yet. And so that was it. But it was not hard to do mechanistically. It was not very elegant. It was just we have all this data and we know that this is becoming important. The problem with that is this particular parameter changes with depth to bedrock. I envision New England, and this only works here. So this is also, if you were a practicing engineer in California, this actually starts to not work quite as well because you need a particular condition, which is really hard basement rock with really soft soils over it. And that's what New England has because basically the glaciers come down, they wipe out everything soft, they scrape this really old, we also have old hard bedrock, scrape it down to bedrock, they retreat and deposit all these glacial deposits that are soft and in a lot of cases, soft and unconsolidated outwash from the glaciers. In a lot of cases, they're hard too. Tills, really compact tills at the base of the glaciers. So we have these particular conditions. And F-naught, therefore, doesn't just change by the type of geology it's in. It doesn't just change by the type of geology it's in, which shear wave velocity kind of does. You're in clay, it's soft. You're in till, it's a little bit harder. That's all a shear wave velocity tells you. F-naught also tells you how deep it is to that hard bedrock. So it's a function of both how deep the bedrock is and how stiff the soil is, which is extremely analogous to a building or a guitar string of different lengths and different stiffnesses will change in pitch. It's the same sort of governing idea. So deeper to bedrock, lower velocity, lower frequency. Shallower to bedrock, higher velocity, higher frequency. So we knew that bedrock was important, and our old maps didn't account for that. And we knew that. But we just didn't have the right information.
Awesome. So is the shallow to bedrock, high frequency, is that what's going to be, generally speaking, more damaging to buildings?
No, it depends because that there gets to the core of why this paper is both supposed to be a cool thing methodologically, but cuts to the issue with VS30 is buildings have it doesn't matter. It's neither good nor bad what the frequency is. It only matters what the building fundamental frequency is and if that lines up. So a really short building on Cape Cod, if there's a big earthquake, those waves will get amplified at low frequencies because Cape Cod is really deep and unconsolidated sands. It's a terminal moraine. But that same building, shorter buildings have higher fundamental frequencies, and so those two aren't going to line up. It's not going to be.
That's perfectly fine.
Perfect.
For that short building.
I mean, it still probably wouldn't be good, but yeah.
We less damaging.
Yes,
than if it were to be a
If
tall
we're just
building.
like thinking statistically, we're less worried about the site response issues here.
Much better way to put it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Whereas in downtown Boston, which also is deep deposits, low velocity clays, and urban fills. So like
I was about to say a lot of that's
really gross,
man-made as well.
man-made urban fills, low frequencies between like 1 and 3 hertz, and those are sort of right in the wheelhouse for like 10-story buildings.
Okay.
So like it's where those two match up that the risk is the highest. So that's like you have to make, if you're in the 70s, you know this phenomenon, you have to pick a number. You do. That's what you need to do. That's how humans work. We're just saying we've understood this, but like we now know all these issues with VS30 and we have the bandwidth and the data to add a little bit more to it. And so that's what F-naught is trying to do. Yeah, so like our original maps of Boston were just these big like downtown Boston polygons that say 2 hertz with a standard deviation of like, I don't know, or a range of from 1 to 4. But it just was like kind of one number, and it was just saying here's this like general range that we think you're going to get. And this one, because we had this depth to bedrock information, again, that was the hardest part of this project. UMass Amherst Geological Department, they compiled depth to bedrock data and made this beautiful surface. And we were onto that early, and so we were like, that data is essential for what we're doing. So we are just piggybacking on that great data set. So we just took that data set of depth to bedrock. We took a geologic model, a superficial geologic map. We assigned these really general uncertain shear wave velocities to the different geologic units. And I'm not gonna lie, man, you pretty much just multiply it together to get F-naught. Like it's F-naught equal, it's shear wave velocity over 4 times the depth. That's
yeah.
If you turn the crank on that paper, all those pretty pictures, that's all it is.
Yeah.
We added a little like interesting stuff by categorizing the uncertainty. That's the coolest. That's cool in there, but well. That's cool in there. The fact that I have shear wave velocity profiles in here, something that you can map onto physical reality, is rare for like a PhD student nowadays, with machine learning being a thing. Like you could also make a model where under the hood it's just a machine learning algorithm or an AI algorithm aimlessly making predictions that you're trying to get from a set of parameters, and there's no way to map it onto anything physical. So this was a study where we connected all these real parameters in space, depth, shear wave velocity, and F-naught, which are derived from these real things. And I'm giving you these shear wave velocity things, which mean something in space, are real measurable parameters. An estimate of them. Obviously, I set all these assumptions. We didn't have to do that. Like this paper would be equivalent. The results would be equivalent without providing any of these shear wave velocity profiles. So it was us trying to be like, we understand this system well enough that we can make the connection between F-naught and depth through shear wave velocity profiles with these alpha and beta coefficients. We're getting into the weeds here. I don't know. Yeah.
This is exactly what I want to hear. I don't know if anybody else will be interested, but that's all right.
Yeah, this is deep in the weeds.
No, this is again exactly what I wanted to hear about. So I appreciate that. Okay, so where's this paper now? So it's almost going to be published, hopefully, some point soon. In the production pipeline, I should say. How about the data set?
The data set will be published with the
same time?
Usually when you submit, you can submit a electronic supplement.
Mm-hmm.
So I've already made that. It's also submitted with the thesis, so it does exist, but not in a very digestible format. It's hard to navigate ProQuest.
Yeah.
But my other one, same deal. Like you can download those maps and stuff and all the points.
Yeah.
And in my perfect world, you should be able to redo the calculation from all these. The depth to bedrock model is already published on MassGIS along with the original.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So the depth to bedrock from UMass?
Yeah, so I'm on that paper, and that's like
sweet.
the DOT production, and I made the VS30 map that's on MassGIS. So back to, you want people to be able to make decisions, and the world's really hard, and not everybody can learn what site response is or why it's important. Steve made the depth to bedrock model, how this chapter ended up happening was I was like, I'll make the VS30 model. It's pretty easy. I'll do it in a really simple way. I assume just a straight shear wave velocity profile, fun fact. So this was Laurie and me doing it more elegantly than that. So that's already on MassGIS. So like the depth to bedrock model, which I didn't help build, I consulted on, I would say, but Steve and this other guy, Chris, super cool, like great GIS, like artist, I would say. They made that model. And then I made it's the NEHRP site classification map is basically that model, which is depth overlaid with this surficial geology map, which we assigned shear wave velocities to, calculated VS30, made site classes. So everyone can look at these seismic site classes online. So those are available, easily accessible, and currently being used.
Wait, sorry. So then I think I just missed something there. So then what's the difference between the shear wave velocity map you made for them versus this one being created
The
here?
one I made for them prompted this chapter because it doesn't account for uncertainty, and it doesn't account for those lower shear wave velocity profile near surface layers. So Laurie and I did two things, which was these F-naughts and VS30s is figure 21. That's different than that's a different way of calculating it than we did for what's currently on MassGIS. MassGIS is a really, really easy calculation, which is totally sufficient and barely differs from this. But because it's the last chapter of your dissertation, we were like, let's go and make this harder. And so we took their uncertainty. The one on MassGIS, just the depth to bedrock model spits out a single number and it says that's reality. It's just this one number. We know that's not real. So we took the uncertainty and the depth to bedrock. We then made that power law assumption and we calculated uncertainty. We created that methodology. You can argue about it all you want. I promise you the reviewers will be like, here's how I would have done it. Like, yeah, that's fair. Like, yeah, good point. But we made that to try to quantify uncertainty of the shear wave velocity profile, and we propagated both of those uncertainties through to calculate F-naught and VS30. So there's the MassGIS VS30 database or site class database is going to look extremely similar to the VS30 median map on figure 22 here. Mm-hmm. It's almost exactly the same, but it's calculated in a way less elegant way. This calculation for the exact same product takes like a day plus. The one on MassGIS is just really freaking easy. It takes like 0.001 seconds.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice.
But they get like the same number. It's just this one, if you are really curious and you want to do like a statistical model, this also has a product of, it's a distribution of possible VS30s. And that's the difference. That's the difference between this paper and what's out there. And for all practical purposes, what's on MassGIS is all you need. You know, the world's hard. Like, you don't have time to like assume distributions and make decisions based on those distributions.
But if you can,
like
awesome.
You should. Like, if you have the bandwidth to do that, like, you're gonna come out on top. Like, I'm not gonna lie. Like, that's what the Googles of the world are doing.
Yeah.
You know, they are making models that are that elegant. You know, the MassGIS website's for like the DOT.
Yeah.
So they're not necessarily doing that.
So then the site classes that come out of this, we have A, B, C, D.
Yep.
Are those are just based on
VS30.
median of the VS30 distribution?
Yep.
So,
yeah. D would be the lowest VS30, which is a proxy for site response hazard. And so, yeah, in theory, if you have a site class D or E, which doesn't end up coming out in this, those would require the most money in engineering to account for.
Okay.
Whereas site class A, you're like, there's going to be no site response. We're on hard rock. There's no site response.
Okay, awesome.
That's what that means.
So that's how that's eventually used in the geotechnical.
Yeah. So hilarious fun fact. In the real world, you need to make assumptions, and we're in Massachusetts. So let's just take a pretty conservative site class, assume it's going to be this. We're not going. We don't need to go out and take all these measurements.
Sweet.
But we do if it's clear that it's possibly worse than that. We'll absolutely do that every time. But
awesome.
We'll like really classify it. But you don't have in California they probably do a formal measurement.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, we do a formal one every time you do a boring. there are correlations from boring blow counts to these site classes. So it's really easy to do, to be honest. It's just trying to quantify that one particular case, and it works its way through how you do the final recommendations and calculations for the design.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think I learned a lot more about this paper going through it with you, and
I'm glad.
about your research in general.
Cool.
And,
yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. One positive note I had to add to this. You had a very clear shift in tone from one section to the next. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it made it for much easier read to go from like for example, like switching from the introduction to the methodology. It's a very clear shift in tone of writing, which actually made it, I thought that made it a lot more easier to understand, where you're going, okay, here's the methodology. Here's how Marshall's talking about the methodology. It makes it much easier to understand. And then you go into discussion and it's like, okay, it's a little more casual, a little more here's what's important to understand, here's why it's used, that kind of thing.
As you may have gotten from my story, I'm a methodology guy. So I had the entire methodology section programmed up, and the numbers in those figures were done, and the methodology section was written aggressively. Like, it takes a ton of focus to write something like that. Like, you kind of have to
and write it well.
Yeah, and like write it and be right. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. Like, I kind of knew what I wanted, but it's like hard, and you're like sitting on a computer like trying to make this thing work, and that's like hard. So yeah, I like write the methodology section, and I make all the figures first. This is my best introduction section ever. Laurie had a huge say in it, and she's outstanding at intro sections. So that also, you might be getting some of her tone in there.
That makes sense, yeah.
But yeah, these were written at different times. And this was like I've always spent a ton of time on my method section. I've always found that easy. Not easy, but like, you don't have to tell any humans what the point of what you do is. You could just make up some system and write about it. Like, I can do anything. Like, I could just like write about how I'm adding numbers together if I wanted to. Laurie knows where a lot of this stuff is. She knows it better than anybody else, and she knows where it sits in the context of the practice. That Walden Allen 2007 one, that's us trying to weave in this VS30 history and how we're trying to say, this is the same story. We're telling the same exact story. We're just using a different parameter, and here's why we think this parameter is important, period. That's the whole point of the whole thing. And the methodology section is just like me doing some, I think, clever stuff to get this output. But you could do it any way you want. Every single modeler will do this their own way. That's kind of the curse of science, is like, it's just a system that spits out a number that's reasonable, but you could do it an infinite number of ways of varying degrees of accuracy and ability.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you walking me through it all. Any final thoughts on the paper, your research in general you want to talk about?
I don't know. I definitely think you got to make figures. Like, if I'm gonna,
I like that.
If I'm gonna PSA, I think that language has some enormous drawbacks of trying to communicate. And like, you don't have to be a scientist. Like, I just think like, if you can sort of draw something out, like draw out your ideas, like to brainstorm or whatever, I like think that language is like, has its limits, and like the world's like really freaking complicated, and like that's fine. But like, there are more tools than just language to try to understand it, and especially communicate it without being a jerk too. Like being like, yeah, just like try and be clear. Like, we're just trying to like figure stuff out. Mm-hmm. Like, if you can make a nice, simple, elegant figure, or let's go back to writing, just write a nice 3-sentence email that's like what you're trying to communicate. Like, that's the goal. And I'm not saying that I'm good at that necessarily, but like, that's a good thing to strive for. Like, we all know the world's complicated. What can you do to like make it a little simpler and like try and move the ball forward a little bit? That'll be my PSA, if that's what you were asking for.
Yeah, no, I do this with everyone, where I kind of give them the floor at the end if they have any closing thoughts. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it all.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks. This was super cool.